Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The winter of 1894 had descended upon London with a vengeance that old residents claimed surpassed even the legendary freeze of '78. Snow lay thick and pristine across the great metropolis, transforming its familiar chaos into a landscape of crystalline silence. The very air seemed to bite with each breath, and the usual cacophony of hooves and wheels that marked the city's restless pulse had been muffled to a distant, ghostly murmur. It was on such a morning, when the world beyond our windows at 221B Baker Street appeared as a study in black and white, that I found myself absorbed in the morning papers before our cheerful fire. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, occupied his customary chair opposite, wreathed in the acrid smoke of his briar pipe, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible puzzle that danced among the swirling snowflakes beyond the glass. The tranquillity of our morning was shattered by an urgent rapping at our door, followed immediately by the hurried ascent of footsteps upon the stairs. Before Mrs. Hudson could announce our visitor, the door burst open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his usually immaculate appearance dishevelled by his battle with the elements. Snow clung to his dark overcoat, and his weathered face bore the expression of a man who had encountered something that challenged his considerable experience. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade began without preamble, his breath visible in small puffs despite the warmth of our sitting-room, "I bring you a case that has left Scotland Yard completely baffled. We have discovered what can only be described as an impossibility." Holmes set aside his pipe with deliberate precision, his attention now fully engaged. That subtle transformation from languid contemplation to razor-sharp focus never failed to fascinate me. "Pray be seated, Lestrade, and tell us everything. Watson, perhaps some tea for our friend. The cold has clearly tested his constitution." Lestrade accepted the steaming cup I offered with grateful hands before settling into the chair beside our hearth. "The facts are these, gentlemen. Early this morning, in the private garden of Sir Alistair Finch's estate in Hampstead, we discovered a scene that defies all rational explanation." Sir Alistair Finch, the name resonated even in my less encyclopedic mind. The reclusive antiquarian was known throughout scholarly circles for his vast collection of ancient manuscripts and his expertise in forgotten histories. His sprawling estate, with its untamed gardens and Gothic architecture, had long been the subject of local folklore. "Continue," Holmes urged, leaning forward with evident interest. "Sir Alistair was found dead in his rose garden this morning, lying peacefully in the deep snow as if he had simply laid down to rest. No marks of violence, no signs of struggle, no indication of the cause of death. But here, Mr. Holmes, is where the case becomes truly extraordinary." Lestrade paused, his eyes reflecting a mixture of professional frustration and genuine bewilderment. Standing upright in the snow beside the body was a single candle, a common tallow candle, approximately half consumed. The remarkable thing, gentlemen, is that this candle had been burning. The wax showed clear evidence of having been lit for several hours, yet the snow around it remained completely undisturbed and unmelted. I felt my breath catch in my throat. A candle burning in the midst of a blizzard, leaving the surrounding snow pristine. The very notion seemed to mock the fundamental laws of nature. "More puzzling still," Lestrade continued, "there were no footprints in the snow leading to or from the scene, save those of the housekeeper who discovered the body. The snow had fallen continuously throughout the night, and the garden showed no signs of any human presence until Mrs. Gable's discovery at dawn." Holmes remained perfectly still throughout this recitation, but I could see the familiar gleam of intellectual excitement beginning to kindle in his eyes. "Tell me, Inspector, what do you know of Sir Alistair's recent circumstances? Had he enemies, financial difficulties, any unusual behaviour in the days preceding his death? Sir Alistair was a man of impeccable reputation, Lestrade replied. A widower these past 10 years, devoted to his scholarly pursuits and charitable works. His household staff speaks of him with genuine affection. However, his nephew, Mr. Elias Thorne, mentioned that his uncle had seemed unusually agitated in recent days, speaking of an appointment of utmost importance, and insisting on wearing his finest evening clothes despite having no known social engagements. Holmes rose from his chair with sudden energy, his tall frame casting a long shadow across our sitting room. "This is clearly no ordinary death, Watson. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create this mysterious tableau. The question that intrigues me most is not how the candle came to be there, but why someone would choose such an elaborate and seemingly impossible method of communication." "Communication?" I asked, echoing my own confusion. "Oh yes, Watson, but this is undoubtedly a message, though its meaning remains obscure. The placement of a burning candle beside a dead man in fresh snow, it speaks of ritual, of symbolism, of someone who wishes to convey meaning through impossibility itself." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the still falling snow with that peculiar intensity I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases. "Tell me, Lestrade, I assume the scene remains undisturbed?" "I've posted constables to ensure nothing is touched, until you can examine it personally, Mr. Holmes." "Excellent. Watson, fetch your coat and medical bag. We shall examine this impossible candle for ourselves." Holmes paused at the door, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey morning light. "I suspect we shall find that the impossible has a perfectly logical explanation, though perhaps not the one our mysterious correspondent intended us to discover." As we prepared to venture into the bitter cold of that December morning, I found myself gripped by a familiar mixture of anticipation and unease. The image of that solitary flame burning impossibly in the pristine snow seemed to beckon us towards secrets that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to both reveal and conceal. The case of the candle that burned in the snow had begun, and I sensed that before its resolution we would be drawn into a web of deception more intricate than any we had previously encountered. Holmes's confidence in finding a logical explanation was reassuring. Yet something about this particular impossibility suggested that even his extraordinary faculties would be tested to their limits. The game, as my friend was fond of saying, was most decidedly afoot. The cab that carried us through the snow-laden streets of London struggled valiantly against the mounting drifts, our driver's skill tested by conditions that had transformed familiar thoroughfares into treacherous white channels. Holmes sat in contemplative silence throughout our journey, his keen grey eyes fixed upon the swirling flakes beyond the frost-etched window, though I knew his mind was already dissecting the fragments of information Lestrade had provided. Occasionally he would mutter some observation under his breath, once commenting upon the unusual depth of snow accumulation, another time noting the peculiar stillness of the air that suggested the storm's centre had passed over London during the night. As we turned into the tree-lined avenue leading to Sir Alistair's estate, Holmes suddenly broke his silence. "Tell me, Lestrade," he said without shifting his gaze from the window. "You approached the house from the rear entrance first, did you not? Your boots carry traces of service path gravel beneath the snow, and there is the distinct aroma of hothouse plants clinging to your coat, a conservatory, I should venture." The inspector shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Quite right, Mr. Holmes. We tried the servants' entrance initially. The front door was bolted from within. There is indeed a conservatory that opens onto the rose garden where we found the body." "Bolted from within," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "And who admitted you?" "Judson, the butler, a reliable man by all accounts." Holmes nodded, filing away this information with the methodical precision that marked all his investigations. When our cab finally drew to a halt before the imposing Gothic facade of the Finch estate, the world around us seemed wrapped in an otherworldly silence. The mansion loomed through the falling snow like something from a medieval romance, its towers and gables creating a silhouette that belonged to an age of mysteries and shadows. We were met at the entrance by a tall, dignified man of middle years whose composed demeanour could not entirely mask the worry lines that had etched themselves deeper around his eyes since the morning's discovery. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade, Dr. Watson," he said with a respectful bow. "I am Judson, Sir Alister's butler. I have preserved the scene exactly as you requested, though I confess the sight has shaken the entire household." Holmes regarded the man with that mixture of sympathy and professional interest that he reserved for those touched by tragedy. "You have done admirably under trying circumstances, Judson. We shall examine the garden first, then I shall require a word with you and Mrs. Gable. Is Mr. Elias Thorne available?" "He awaits you in the library, sir. The young gentleman has been most distressed by his uncle's passing." The path to the rose garden led us through grounds that even in winter's grip showed evidence of meticulous care. Ancient oak trees stood sentinel along the walkway, their bare branches creating intricate lacework patterns against the grey sky. The conservatory, when we reached it, proved to be an impressive structure of glass and iron, its lower panes clouded with the frozen breath of exotic ferns within. "The garden lies just beyond," Lestrade announced, gesturing toward a glass door that opened from the conservatory onto the snow-covered grounds. The scene that greeted us defied both logic and natural law. Sir Alister Finch lay upon his back in the centre of a small clearing, positioned between two rows of dormant rose bushes. His evening dress was immaculate, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, and pristine gloves that stood out starkly against the snow. His face bore an expression of such profound peace that he might have been sleeping, his silver hair neatly arranged despite his outdoor repose. Most extraordinary of all, standing upright in the pristine snow, perhaps 3 feet from his left shoulder, was the candle that had so confounded Scotland Yard. Holmes approached the scene with the careful deliberation of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. He circled the area slowly, his trained eye cataloguing every detail of the undisturbed snow, the positioning of the body, and the impossible sentinel of wax and flame that had somehow burned through the night's blizzard. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, kneeling beside the extinguished candle. "The evidence of prolonged burning is unmistakable. Note the pool of hardened wax at its base and the characteristic shape of the remaining tallow. Yet the snow surrounding its base shows no sign whatsoever of melting." He produced his magnifying glass and examined the candle with minute attention. "The composition is curious, not pure tallow, but mixed with stearine for a steadier burn. And here—" he scraped a small sample of the wax with a pin from his lapel, rolling it between his fingers before touching it to his tongue with fastidious delicacy. "Salt has been added to the mixture, Watson. A most unusual addition for a common candle." I knelt beside my friend, studying the impossible tableau. But how could such a flame have persisted through the blizzard without melting the surrounding snow? That, my dear fellow, is precisely the question our mysterious correspondent intended us to ask. Holmes straightened and turned his attention to the body itself. "With your permission, Inspector, Dr. Watson should conduct his examination." I approached Sir Alister's still form with professional detachment, though the peaceful expression on his weathered features stirred an unexpected sympathy. My preliminary examination revealed no obvious signs of violence, no wounds, No evidence of strangulation, no indication of struggle. His pupils were slightly dilated, which might suggest the presence of some narcotic substance, though the cold made such observations less reliable. His clothing is completely dry beneath the accumulated snow, I reported, suggesting he had not been exposed to the elements for very long before the snowfall began. The fabric shows no tears or stains. However, there is a curious detail. I indicated a small smear upon the dark velvet of his lapel. Some form of pomatum, I believe, with a distinctly foreign scent. Aniseed, perhaps, or fennel. Holmes examined the substance I had indicated, his nostrils dilating slightly. Continental in origin, I should say. Not a preparation with which a gentleman of Sir Alister's refined tastes would be familiar. He moved to examine the soles of the dead man's shoes with characteristic thoroughness. No grit in the treads, Watson. The leather is dry at the seams, though the uppers show flecks of snow. He walked out upon the snow, but crossed no wet ground. The absence of footprints remains our greatest puzzle, Lestrade interjected. Mrs. Gable's tracks are the only ones visible, leading directly from the house to where she discovered the body and back again. The snow fell continuously throughout the night. Whoever arranged this scene left no trace of their presence. Holmes had moved to the conservatory door, examining its handle with keen interest. He produced a small glass vial from his pocket and, with practiced efficiency, took an impression of what appeared to be a fingerprint upon the metal surface. "Judson may be a tidy man," he observed, "but last night someone opened this door with hands that carried soot or ink, left-handed from the angle of the impression." As we stood contemplating this latest clue, a movement at the library window caught my attention. A young man with pale features and dark hair stood watching us, his expression hovering between grief and something less easily defined. Upon noticing our gaze, he started and disappeared from view, only to emerge moments later through the conservatory. "I am Elias Thorne," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You must be Mr. Holmes. Thank you for coming so quickly. My uncle—" His voice faltered. "Can you tell me anything? How did this happen?" Holmes regarded the young man with that grave gentleness he sometimes employed when dealing with the bereaved. "I can tell you that your uncle met his death without struggle, Mr. Thorne, and that the circumstances surrounding his passing were carefully orchestrated for a specific purpose. Whether to conceal, reveal, or threaten, I cannot yet determine. You were with Sir Alister yesterday evening. For about an hour, he seemed agitated, insisting on dressing in his finest evening clothes despite having no known engagements. He spoke repeatedly of an appointment of utmost importance, scheduled for midnight. When I pressed him for details, he merely laughed and sent me away at 10 o'clock. And the household retired at the usual hour. Judson secured the house at 11, as is his custom. He keeps all the keys." The young man's eyes darted nervously between Holmes and the scene of his uncle's death. I begged Uncle Alister not to remain alone, but he was quite insistent. Holmes's penetrating gaze rested upon Elias Thorne for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable before returning to survey the impossible scene before us. "We shall need to examine your uncle's study, Mr. Thorne, and speak with each member of the household staff. Someone has presented us with an elaborate puzzle, and I intend to discover not only how it was accomplished, but why such extraordinary measures were deemed necessary." As we prepared to return to the house, I found myself haunted by the image of that solitary candle standing vigil over the peaceful corpse. The mystery deepened with each observation, each clue seeming to contradict the laws of nature themselves. Yet I knew from long experience that Holmes's methodical approach would eventually illuminate the truth, however carefully it had been concealed beneath layers of impossibility and misdirection. The game was indeed afoot, and I sensed that before its conclusion we would be drawn into a web of deception more intricate than any we had previously encountered. The warmth of the conservatory enveloped us as we stepped back from the bitter cold, the humid air thick with the exotic perfume of tropical blooms that seemed almost decadent against the stark mystery we had witnessed. Holmes paused among the towering ferns and delicate orchids, but his attention was not on the botanical specimens. Instead, his keen eyes swept across the flagstone floor with methodical precision. "Observe, Watson," he said, kneeling beside the door we had just used. "The stones here are completely dry, despite the moisture that pervades the rest of the conservatory. Someone stood in this exact spot long enough for body heat to warm the flagstones through their shoes, evaporating any condensation." He ran his gloved finger along the brass door handle, examining it with his magnifying glass. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanism made within the past day. Someone has been at this door with tools, and recently Judson shifted uncomfortably behind us. "Sir Alistair did occasionally work late among his specimens, sir. He was most particular about maintaining proper conditions for his collection." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, but his attention had already moved to something else entirely. Following his gaze, I noticed what had escaped my initial observation: a small, discreet wooden door set into the far wall of the conservatory, almost hidden behind a magnificent specimen of tree fern. "And where, pray tell, does that lead?" "A seldom used passage, sir," Judson replied with evident reluctance. "It connects directly to Sir Alistair's private study, built for his convenience in accessing the conservatory without disturbing the main household." Holmes's grey eyes lit with that familiar spark of discovery. "A private passage, how very convenient indeed. And was this passage secured last night?" The butler's hesitation spoke volumes. "Sir Alistair preferred to oversee the security of his private study and its connecting passages himself, sir. I cannot say with certainty whether it was locked." We followed Holmes through the narrow door into a corridor that smelled of old paper and scholarly dust. The passage was barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast, its walls lined with simple, wooden panelling that spoke of utilitarian purpose rather than architectural grandeur. At its terminus stood another heavy oak door clearly leading into the heart of the mansion. Sir Alistair's study proved to be a scholar's sanctuary, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and ancient manuscripts. A massive mahogany desk dominated the centre of the room, still bearing the detritus of scholarly work, papers, an inkwell, and what appeared to be a half-finished letter. The dying embers in the grate cast dancing shadows across the chamber, creating an atmosphere of brooding contemplation. Holmes began his examination with characteristic thoroughness, his long frame moving with surprising grace as he absorbed every detail. Near the base of an antique globe standing in the corner, partially obscured by a Persian rug, his sharp eyes detected something that had escaped all previous observation. "Watson," he said softly, kneeling with his magnifying glass, "observe this mark upon the polished wood, fresh, certainly not from regular wear, and note the peculiar shape as if something heavy had been dragged across the floor. The groove suggests a tripod or similar three-legged apparatus." I peered closely at the faint scratches he indicated. Indeed, there was an unmistakable pattern inconsistent with the movement of ordinary furniture. Could it be connected to our mysterious candle? All things are connected in a well-orchestrated deception, my dear fellow. The question is determining which connections are genuine and which are deliberately misleading. Holmes moved to examine the bookshelves, his fingers trailing across leather spines with practiced efficiency. He paused at one volume, a thick treatise on ancient burial rites, whose spine sat slightly askew from its neighbours. Opening it revealed pages marked with thin bookmarks, all relating to funerary customs involving symbolic lights. "Curious reading material for a gentleman expecting a midnight appointment," he observed, closing the book with a decisive snap. Our investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, whose honest countenance bore the strain of the morning's terrible discovery. She was a woman of middle years whose competent manner suggested decades of faithful service to the household. "You found Sir Alister this morning?" Holmes said gently, settling into a chair to put the woman at ease. "At dawn, sir, when I went to check the conservatory boilers," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I looked out through the glass and saw something dark against the white snow. When I realized what it was, I nearly fainted from the shock." "You observed the candle as well?" "Indeed, sir. It was burning with a low blue flame when I first saw it, like something you might see in church during a vigil. The flame went out when Mr. Judson opened the door wide. The draught extinguished it." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "Low and blue, you say? That detail is most significant, Mrs. Gable. Tell me, what was Sir Alister's demeanour yesterday evening?" "Most agitated, sir. He insisted on having his finest evening clothes laid out, despite having no engagements that I knew of. He also requested that the good brandy be brought up from the cellar, the bottle he reserves for only the most important occasions. Strange that, since Sir Alister rarely partook of spirits himself." "He was expecting a visitor then?" "So it seemed, sir. He spoke of an appointment of utmost importance, and asked that he not be disturbed after 10 o'clock. Most unusual behaviour for a gentleman of such regular habits." Holmes rose and moved to the window, examining the glass panes with minute attention. Using his magnifying glass, he studied the brass catches and window frame with the intensity of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. "Watson, observe these minute abrasions upon the window catch, made by metal drawn across under tension. Recent, judging by their brightness against the weathered brass." I joined him at the window, noting the tiny scratches he indicated. "What do you make of them?" "Someone has been manipulating this window from the outside, using tools and considerable ingenuity. The pattern suggests a cord or wire was employed to operate the catch remotely." Holmes straightened, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Mrs. Gable, when you discovered the body, you approached directly from the house?" "Yes, sir. Through the conservatory and straight to where Sir Alister lay. I touched nothing and returned immediately to summon Mr. Judson." "And your footprints were the only ones visible in the snow?" "The only ones, sir. The garden was pristine except for where I had walked." Holmes nodded slowly, pieces of an intricate puzzle beginning to align in his remarkable mind. He moved to the fireplace, where cold ashes lay in the grate. Using a poker, he stirred the remains carefully, extracting several partially burned fragments of paper. "Someone has been destroying correspondence," he announced, holding a charred fragment to the light. "I can make out only a few words: midnight, and what appears to be consequences. The paper quality suggests personal letters rather than business documents." Elias Thorne, who had been hovering nervously in the doorway, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Uncle Alister had been receiving some rather persistent correspondence lately. Letters from collectors and antiquarians interested in his research. Some seemed more insistent than others. Insistent in what manner? Uncle Alister mentioned that certain parties were eager to acquire not just his manuscripts but his latest discoveries. He seemed both intrigued and troubled by their attention. Holmes examined the young man with that penetrating gaze that seemed to catalogue every detail of appearance and manner. You were with your uncle yesterday evening?" "Until 10 o'clock, when he dismissed me." He was clearly preparing for something important, though he would not elaborate on the nature of his appointment. "And you retired to your rooms immediately?" "Yes, sir. I heard the hall clock strike midnight from my chambers. I did not leave the house." Holmes made no immediate comment, but I observed him noting details about Elias Thorne's appearance, his left-handed manner of gesturing, the faint traces of ink upon his cuff, and something else that seemed to catch his attention before he turned away. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes said suddenly, "I shall require certain items from the gardener's shed, specifically any long poles used for pruning and the narrow boards employed for walking between flower beds without disturbing the soil. Also, please inquire whether any sledge or hand-barrow was moved last night." Lestrade's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he dispatched a constable immediately. Holmes watched him go before turning back to our assembled group with an expression that suggested he was beginning to see the outline of a solution, though its complete form remained hidden. "The candle that burned in the snow presents us with an impossibility that demands explanation," he said thoughtfully. "Yet I suspect that impossibility is precisely the point, a performance designed to capture our attention while other, more subtle deceptions pass unnoticed." He moved once more to examine the hidden passage between the study and conservatory, his long fingers tracing the doorframe with meticulous care. "Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create this mystery, employing both ancient knowledge and modern ingenuity. The question that remains is whether we are meant to solve it, or whether the very act of investigation serves some deeper purpose." As the afternoon light began to fade beyond the study windows, I found myself increasingly convinced that we had encountered something far more complex than a simple case of mysterious death. The convergence of impossible physical evidence, destroyed correspondence, and carefully orchestrated circumstances suggested a mind of remarkable cunning at work. Holmes stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, his sharp profile reflecting the intensity of concentration I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to reveal themselves, but their ultimate configuration remained tantalizingly out of reach. The game was indeed afoot, and I sensed that before its conclusion we would be drawn deeper into a web of deception more intricate than any we had previously encountered. The constable's return interrupted our contemplation, his arms laden with the requested items from the gardener's shed. Behind him came Lestrade, brushing fresh snow from his coat, his expression bearing the satisfaction of a man who had discovered something significant. "The pruning poles and garden boards, as requested, Mr. Holmes," the inspector announced, directing the constable to arrange the items near the study's hearth. Most interesting discoveries, I must say. The longest pole shows traces of wax near its tip, and one of the boards bears curious scratches along its edge, as if it had been dragged across rough ground. Holmes examined each item with his characteristic intensity, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to ordinary observation. He lifted the 8-foot pruning pole, studying its metal tip with particular attention. "Observe, Watson, not merely wax, but a compound mixture. The residue shows traces of stearin combined with what appears to be alcohol-based spirits." He scraped a minute sample with his penknife and held it to the light. When burned, such a mixture would produce a flame of distinctly blue coloration, burning with greater heat concentration in an upward column rather than radiating outward to the surrounding area. "The blue flame, Mrs. Gable observed," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Precisely, and here?" Holmes knelt beside the narrow garden boards, running his fingers along their weathered surfaces. "These planks are designed for walking between flower beds without disturbing delicate plantings. Laid end to end, they would provide a stable pathway above the snow's surface, allowing someone to traverse the garden without leaving footprints. Lestrade nodded slowly. So our mysterious perpetrator used these boards to reach the scene, then employed the pole to position the candle at the required distance. An elegant solution to an apparently impossible problem, Holmes confirmed. But the true ingenuity lies in the candle's construction. The alcohol stearin mixture ensured a steady blue flame that burned upward rather than outward, while some form of insulation beneath, perhaps a disc of glass or ceramic, prevented the heat from melting the surrounding snow. Our discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, the estate's gardener, summoned by Judson at Holmes's request. The weathered man entered with the respectful deference of one accustomed to serving his betters, his honest countenance marked by decades of outdoor labour. "You wish to see me, sir?" Thomas addressed Holmes with evident curiosity. "Indeed, I am interested in your methods for protecting delicate plants during harsh weather. Do you employ warming candles in your work?" The old gardener's eyes brightened with professional pride. "Aye, sir, a trick passed down from my father. We use special candles treated with salt and stearin for steady burning, positioned beneath glass cloches to create pockets of warm air without disturbing the snow cover. The heat rises in a narrow column, you see, leaving the ground-level snow untouched." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me. "And these treated candles, do they burn with any particular characteristics?" "Blue flames, sir, especially in cold air. Burns cleaner and hotter than ordinary tallow, though the preparation is somewhat costly." "Most illuminating, Thomas. Tell me, was any of your equipment disturbed last night?" The gardener's expression grew troubled. "Funny you should ask, sir. Found my best pruning pole missing this morning, and the hand barrow had been moved from its usual place. Thought perhaps the wind had blown things about, but with all this snow—" Holmes thanked the gardener and dismissed him before turning to our assembled group. The physical mechanics become clear, though the purpose remains enigmatic. Someone possessed intimate knowledge of gardening techniques and considerable planning ability. They transported Sir Alister's body using the barrow, then created their impossible tableau using tools and methods readily available on the estate. Elias Thorne, who had been listening with growing agitation, stepped forward. "You're suggesting Uncle Alister was murdered? But who would conceive such an elaborate deception?" "Someone who wished to ensure the death would attract attention and investigation," Holmes replied, his penetrating gaze fixed upon the young man. "The question we must ask ourselves is whether this attention was intended to reveal something or to conceal it." Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway with obvious urgency. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's been a development. A gentleman has arrived claiming to have had an appointment with Sir Alister. He seems most distressed to learn of the tragedy." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "And this gentleman's name?" "Professor Heinrich Zimmermann, sir. Says he's travelled from Vienna specifically to meet with Sir Alister regarding some ancient manuscripts. He's waiting in the drawing room, quite beside himself with worry." "Professor Zimmermann," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "Watson, I believe we are about to encounter another piece of our puzzle. The game grows ever more complex." As we prepared to meet this unexpected visitor, I sensed that each revelation brought us closer to understanding the true nature of the conspiracy that had claimed Sir Alister's life. The drawing room of the Finch estate bore the refined elegance of generations of scholarly pursuit, its walls adorned with ancient maps and rare manuscripts displayed in glass cases that caught the firelight with scholarly reverence. The gentleman who awaited us presented a striking figure of continental learning, tall and spare, with prematurely silver hair and the intense, piercing eyes of a dedicated academic. His travelling coat still bore crystals of melting snow, and the faint aroma of foreign tobacco clung to his person, speaking of a hurried journey across the Channel. "Professor Zimmermann," Holmes said, extending his hand with courteous formality. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Inspector Lestrade has informed us of your unexpected arrival." The professor's grip was firm, though I detected the barely perceptible tremor of considerable emotional distress. "Mr. Holmes, I am devastated to learn of Sir Alister's death. We had arranged to meet at midnight regarding the Codex Borealis, a palimpsest of extraordinary significance that Sir Alister believed he had finally deciphered." Holmes settled into a chair with that deceptive casualness that masked his sharpest attention. "This codex, pray elaborate on its importance." Professor Zimmermann's eyes lit with scholarly passion despite his grief. "A 12th century manuscript, scraped and overwritten by devotional text, yet beneath lies an itinerary in cipher with marginalia referring to a candle that burns in snow. Sir Alister had discovered it was a symbol among certain northern fraternities, a sign that a meeting place was secure and the guardian present." I felt the familiar thrill of pieces falling into place, the blue flame, the gardening techniques, the elaborate staging, all connected to ancient scholarly traditions. "Sir Alister's recent correspondence suggested urgency," Holmes observed, producing the charred fragments from the fireplace. "References to midnight and consequences. Was he under threat?" The professor's expression grew grave. Several parties had become aggressively interested in his research. Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy American collector of questionable ethics, had made increasingly insistent offers. Then there was Percival Vale of Bloomsbury, who traffics in what he calls rescuing heritage, but what scholars recognize as theft. Most concerning was Baron von Stauffenberg, whose acquisition methods are notoriously ruthless. Holmes's keen gaze had fixed upon the professor's left hand, where a heavy gold signet ring bearing Byzantine symbols caught the firelight. "A remarkable piece, Professor. The craftsmanship appears authentically ancient." Zimmermann's hand moved instinctively to cover the ring. "A family heirloom passed down through generations of manuscript scholars. The symbols relate to ancient preservation rituals using treated flames." "Indeed. You mentioned Sir Alister's letter regarding blue fire and chemical reagents?" "He had adapted horticultural techniques for textual recovery, using specially treated candles that burn in narrow columns without damaging delicate parchments. The blue flame indicated proper chemical composition for revealing hidden text." Holmes rose suddenly and moved to examine a small writing desk near the window. "Professor, I must ask about your movements last evening. You arrived this morning?" "By the early train from Dover. The storm delayed my crossing, but I came directly here upon reaching London." Holmes had discovered something beneath the desk's leather blotter, a fragment bearing Sir Alister's handwriting. "The appointment cannot be delayed. Too much depends upon the revelation. If anything should happen to me, the truth lies in the flame that burns without consuming." "Another reference to preserved knowledge," I observed. "Or perhaps," Holmes replied thoughtfully, "information that can be shared without being diminished." He moved to examine Judson, who had been hovering near the doorway. "The locked cabinet in Sir Alister's study. Fetch it immediately." When the small mahogany cabinet arrived, Holmes applied a slim tool to its lock, which yielded with a soft click. Inside lay a prism, a bottle of benzene, several soft brushes, and, most significantly, a photographic plate wrapped in protective cloth. "We shall have this developed immediately, Lestrade," Holmes announced, holding the plate carefully to the firelight without exposing it. "It may reveal what Sir Alister discovered in his final hours." Professor Zimmermann leaned forward eagerly. Then the research may survive. There is that possibility, Holmes allowed, though his expression had grown increasingly thoughtful. However, I suspect we are dealing with something far more complex than scholarly rivalry. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create an impossible crime while simultaneously preserving evidence of Sir Alister's work. He turned to address our assembled group with growing authority. No one shall leave the estate until evening. At dusk, I shall conduct an experiment in the conservatory that will reveal who moved through this house last night, and why Sir Alister dressed for a visitor he never intended to admit alive. As the winter afternoon darkened around us, I sensed we stood at the threshold of revelations that would illuminate not only the mystery of the burning candle, but the deeper conspiracy that had claimed Sir Alister's life. The convergence of ancient knowledge, modern deception, and scholarly intrigue promised a resolution as intricate as any we had encountered. The game was indeed reaching its crucial phase, and Holmes's confidence suggested that the truth, like the flame that burns without consuming, was finally ready to be revealed. The winter dusk descended upon the conservatory like a shroud, transforming the glass sanctuary into a cathedral of shadows and dying light. Holmes moved through the humid air with the precision of a conductor preparing his orchestra, directing the placement of equipment with an intensity that spoke of approaching revelation. The treated candle from Thomas's supplies, the glass disc, the pruning pole, each item positioned with mathematical exactitude as our assembled group watched in fascination and growing unease. The photographic plate has yielded results more extraordinary than I had anticipated, Holmes announced, producing the developed image from his inner pocket with ceremonial gravity. The ghostly negative revealed Sir Alister seated at his study desk, but he was not alone. Behind him stood a figure in shadow, identifiable only by the distinctive silhouette of a high-collared continental coat and the unmistakable posture of someone examining the manuscript over Sir Alister's shoulder. Professor Zimmermann leaned forward with scholarly interest. The manuscript illumination technique. I recognized the specialized lamp arrangement. Sir Alister was using treated flame to reveal hidden text, precisely as described in the Codex Borealis. Indeed, Holmes replied, his keen gaze studying each face in turn. But note the clock upon the mantelpiece. 10 minutes past midnight. Sir Alister's appointment was kept, though perhaps not in the manner either party had originally intended. The implications settled over our group like the gathering darkness outside. Holmes lit the treated candle, its blue flame immediately casting an otherworldly glow throughout the conservatory. Using the pruning pole with practiced efficiency, he positioned the burning taper at the precise distance where Sir Alister's body had been discovered. "Observe how the flame burns upward in a concentrated column," he explained, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. The alcohol stearin mixture ensures steady combustion, while the glass disc prevents downward heat radiation. The snow remains pristine because the thermal energy is directed away from the ground surface. Lestrade nodded with grudging admiration. So the murderer used the garden boards to traverse the snow without leaving prints, positioned the candle with the pole, then removed all traces of the mechanism. Precisely, Inspector, but the true genius lies not in the physical impossibility, but in the psychological misdirection. Holmes moved to examine the conservatory's glass panels as the temperature differential between interior and exterior began to create condensation. The elaborate staging was designed to focus our attention on the miraculous candle while obscuring the real significance of Sir Alister's research. As if summoned by Holmes's words, the moisture began to reveal what previous observers had missed. Upon one of the taller glass panes at shoulder height, the condensation gathered around the ghostly outline of a left hand, the oils from human skin resisting the fresh moisture. Most tellingly, upon the ring finger was a distinctive square impression where a heavy signet had pressed against the glass. Holmes produced his magnifying glass and examined a faint smear upon the brass door handle. Aniline ink, violet variety, mixed with traces of aniseed-scented pomatum, he announced, touching the residue with fastidious care. His penetrating gaze moved deliberately between Professor Zimmermann's Byzantine signet ring and Elias Thorne's ink-stained cuff. The manuscript Sir Alister was examining, Holmes continued, was not merely the Codex Borealis, but a palimpsest containing modern notations. Someone had been using ancient texts to record contemporary information, locations, dates, and coded references that would be meaningless to casual observers but invaluable to those initiated in the conspiracy. Professor Zimmermann's composure finally cracked. "Mr. Holmes, if you are suggesting that I was present here last night, I must protest most vigorously. I arrived this morning by the first train from Dover, as I have repeatedly stated." "I suggest nothing yet, Professor," Holmes replied with deceptive mildness. "However, your ring does present a square bezel, and the impression upon the glass is quite distinctive." He paused, allowing the weight of evidence to settle. "Tell me, do you recall the last time you handled a manuscript with violet ink?" The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hiss of the burning candle and Elias Thorne's sharp intake of breath. The young man stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his pale features reflecting the blue flame's eerie glow. "Uncle Alister had been receiving threatening correspondence," he said quietly. "Letters demanding that he share his research or face consequences. He showed me one last week, written in violet ink with a distinctive continental hand. The writer claimed to represent a consortium of collectors who would not be denied access to certain discoveries." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "And your uncle's response to these threats?" He laughed at first, calling them the desperate attempts of academic rivals, but in recent days he had grown increasingly concerned. He spoke of revelations that must be preserved and knowledge that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. "Hence the photographic documentation," Holmes observed. Sir Alister was creating a permanent record of his discoveries, insurance against those who would steal or suppress his work. He moved to extinguish the demonstration candle, but paused as its blue flame caught his attention. "There remains one final test, Watson. The chemical composition of this flame reveals more than its burning characteristics." He produced a small glass slide and held it briefly in the flame's path, then examined the resulting residue through his magnifying glass. "Traces of benzene and silver nitrate," he announced with satisfaction. "Components used in photographic development. Someone has been conducting chemical experiments in this very conservatory, using the specialized flames for purposes beyond manuscript illumination." The assembled group exchanged glances that spoke volumes about suspicions long harbored, but never voiced. Holmes straightened, his tall frame casting dramatic shadows in the flickering light. "The stage has been carefully set, ladies and gentlemen, but the performance is far from concluded. Someone among us possesses intimate knowledge of both scholarly traditions and modern chemical processes, someone who understood that Sir Alister's research threatened their carefully constructed enterprise." His penetrating gaze swept across our assembled group. "At precisely 9 o'clock this evening, I shall conduct a final experiment that will reveal not only the identity of our murderer, but the true significance of the conspiracy that cost Sir Alister his life." As the last light faded beyond the conservatory's glass walls, I sensed that we stood at the threshold of revelations that would illuminate not only the mystery of the impossible candle, but the deeper web of deception that had claimed an innocent scholar's life. The convergence of ancient knowledge, modern chemistry, and international intrigue promised a resolution as intricate as any we had encountered. The game was indeed reaching its crucial phase, and Holmes's confidence suggested that the truth, like the flame that burns without consuming, was finally ready to be revealed in all its terrible clarity. The hours between dusk and 9 o'clock passed with the oppressive weight of impending revelation, each member of our assembled company retreating into private contemplation of the mounting evidence. The conservatory had been transformed into something resembling a laboratory, with Holmes arranging his apparatus with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The treated candle stood ready upon its glass disc, while various chemical compounds and detection materials lay arranged on a small table beside the exotic ferns that seemed to lean inward like curious spectators at some midnight tribunal. Holmes had withdrawn briefly to the study, returning with his cuffs bearing traces of white powder and carrying a leather satchel containing items whose purpose remained tantalizingly obscure. I observed him applying a thin, colorless solution to the brass fittings of both the conservatory door and the private passage entrance, the liquid drying invisibly without leaving any detectable trace. A compound that reacts to specific oils and chemical residues, he explained quietly when I inquired. Under proper conditions, it will reveal what hands have touched these surfaces and what substances they carried. Professor Zimmermann paced restlessly among the plants, his scholarly composure increasingly strained by the weight of suspicion that seemed to gather around his distinctive Byzantine ring. Elias Thorne had positioned himself near the window overlooking the garden, his pale features reflecting an internal struggle between grief and something far more complex. The household staff maintained their professional demeanor, though Mrs. Gable's hands trembled slightly as she arranged additional lamps at Holmes's direction. As the hall clock began its solemn progression toward 9, Holmes lit the treated candle with ceremonial gravity. The blue flame immediately cast its otherworldly glow throughout the conservatory, transforming familiar surroundings into something from an alchemist's vision. The ethereal light played across the assembled faces, revealing expressions of fascination, anxiety, and barely concealed fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "we stand at the threshold of revelation. The elaborate staging of Sir Alistair's death was designed not merely to create an impossible mystery, but to ensure that his final discovery would be preserved and authenticated through official investigation." He moved to examine the brass door handle under the blue flame's illumination, producing his magnifying glass with practiced efficiency. Where his earlier application had seemed to leave no trace, dark impressions now began to bloom upon the metal surface like ghostly fingerprints emerging from the ether. "Observe the chemical reaction," Holmes continued, his keen eyes studying the developing patterns. "The compound reveals not only the presence of human contact, but the specific substances carried by those hands. Here we see traces of violet ink, aniseed-scented pomatum, and most significantly, the distinctive square impression of a heavy signet ring." The assembled group leaned forward with collective fascination as the evidence materialized before their eyes. Upon the conservatory door handle, 3 distinct impressions had appeared: the smear of an inked thumb, the oval impression of an oiled forefinger, and the unmistakable square outline where a ring had pressed against the brass during the act of turning. The photographic plate revealed Sir Alistair working in the company of his killer, Holmes announced, producing the developed image once more. Someone he trusted sufficiently to admit to his private study at midnight, someone familiar enough with his research to understand both its significance and its potential value. Professor Zimmermann stepped forward with obvious agitation. "Mr. Holmes, if you are suggesting that my ring—" "I suggest nothing yet, Professor," Holmes replied with deceptive mildness. However, the evidence speaks with remarkable clarity. The chemical analysis of the pomatum found upon Sir Alister's lapel contains traces of hydrogen cyanide administered in a preparation that would have acted swiftly while leaving no obvious signs of violence. He moved to the private passage door, where his chemical treatment had revealed an even more distinct impression upon the inner handle. The square bezel mark was perfectly preserved, showing not only its shape, but the slight irregularities that would make it as distinctive as a fingerprint to one who knew what to observe. The killer departed through this route, Holmes continued, carefully staging the impossible scene in the garden before returning to establish an alibi within the house itself. The elaborate use of gardening equipment, specialized candles, and chemical knowledge all point to someone with intimate familiarity with both the estate's resources and Sir Alister's scholarly methods. Lestrade had been studying the chemical impressions with growing understanding. Someone from within the household, then, someone with access and opportunity. Indeed, Inspector. But more than mere access was required. This crime demanded detailed knowledge of Sir Alister's research, his habits, his vulnerabilities, and his absolute trust. Holmes's penetrating gaze moved deliberately among the assembled faces before settling upon Elias Thorne with unmistakable intent. The young man had grown increasingly pale throughout Holmes's exposition, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of evidence accumulated. When Holmes's attention fixed upon him, something seemed to crack in his carefully maintained composure. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne," Holmes said with quiet intensity, "when did you first realize that your uncle's discoveries would revolutionize medieval scholarship, and when did you decide that such recognition should not belong to him alone?" The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hiss of the burning candle and the barely audible sound of Elias Thorne's labored breathing. The blue flame continued to cast its eerie glow across the conservatory, illuminating faces frozen in expressions of shock, understanding, and dawning horror. Holmes straightened to his full height, his tall frame casting dramatic shadows in the flickering light. "The game has reached its conclusion, Mr. Thorne. The candle that burned in the snow has preserved the truth, though not in the manner you intended." The young man's eyes darted desperately around the assembled group, seeking some escape from the inexorable logic that had trapped him. But Holmes's methodical reconstruction had woven a net from which there could be no escape, and the moment of final revelation was at hand. The truth, like the flame that burns without consuming, was finally ready to illuminate the terrible conspiracy that had cost Sir Alister Finch his life. The blue flame cast its ethereal glow across Elias Thorne's increasingly pallid features as Holmes's inexorable logic tightened around him like a noose. The young man's hands trembled visibly in the candlelight, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. The silence in the conservatory had become oppressive, broken only by the soft hiss of the burning candle and the barely audible sound of labored breathing. The chemical impressions upon the door handles tell an unambiguous story, Holmes continued with quiet authority, his penetrating gaze never leaving Elias's face. The square bezel mark, the traces of violet ink, the aniseed-scented pomatum, all point to hands that had been in intimate contact with both scholarly materials and deadly preparations. But more than that, they revealed the movements of someone who possessed complete familiarity with this household's routines and resources. Elias's defiance finally shattered like glass beneath an unbearable pressure. His shoulders sagged as if some invisible burden had suddenly doubled, and when he raised his eyes to meet Holmes's unwavering stare, they held the hollow resignation of one whose carefully constructed deception had crumbled beyond repair. "You cannot possibly understand the torment," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the candle's gentle crackling. Uncle Alistair had made discoveries that would revolutionize medieval scholarship, yet he intended to share the credit with that pompous, continental society of Professor Zimmermann's. Years of my research, my insights, my sleepless nights spent deciphering those cursed manuscripts, all to be attributed to his name, while I remained forever in his shadow. Holmes listened with that peculiar mixture of professional fascination and human sympathy that marked his approach to even the most hardened criminals. So you decided that if you could not share in his glory, you would claim it entirely for yourself. The collectors had been pressuring him for months, Elias continued, his confession now flowing with the terrible relief of one who had carried a secret too long. Blackwood's consortium, Vale's antiquarian network, even Baron von Stauffenberg's agents, they all recognized the value of Uncle Alistair's work. They offered sums that exceeded anything academic publication could provide. Professor Zimmermann stepped forward with evident horror. You were prepared to sell irreplaceable historical documents to private collectors? The magnitude of knowledge that would have been lost to humanity? Lost? Elias laughed bitterly. Uncle Alistair's precious manuscripts would have mouldered in some university vault, accessible only to a handful of dusty academics. The private collectors understood their true worth. Holmes moved closer, his keen eyes cataloguing every nuance of expression and gesture. But your uncle discovered your correspondence with these collectors. The midnight appointment was not with any outside party, but with you. A final confrontation about your betrayal of his trust. He found my letters hidden behind one of his Byzantine codices, Elias admitted, his voice growing stronger with defiant justification. He threatened to disinherit me completely, to expose my negotiations to the entire academic community. Everything I had worked toward would have been destroyed by his sanctimonious principles. So you prepared the cyanide-laced pomatum, Holmes continued with clinical precision, knowing your uncle's scholarly habits of examining documents through touch as well as sight. The aniseed scent would mask any chemical odor, while the oily preparation ensured rapid absorption through the skin. I recalled the foreign-scented smear I had observed on Sir Alistair's lapel, now revealed as the instrument of his demise. The method was both ingenious and horrifying in its calculated intimacy. The elaborate staging in the garden served multiple purposes, Holmes explained to our assembled group. It created an impossible mystery that would ensure official investigation, legitimizing any subsequent authentication of Sir Alistair's research. More importantly, it provided a theatrical distraction from the simple truth of familial murder. Elias nodded with bitter pride. I spent weeks perfecting the technique, studying Thomas's candle preparations, experimenting with the glass insulation, practicing the precise positioning required to create an apparently supernatural event. Uncle Alistair's own gardening knowledge provided the very tools of his memorial. But you made several crucial errors, Holmes observed, producing his magnifying glass to examine the chemical residue on the door handle once more. The photographic plate your uncle was examining when you killed him captured more than his scholarly triumph. It preserved the shadow of his murderer, the height, the posture, the distinctive way you hold your left shoulder slightly elevated, all perfectly preserved in silver nitrate and gelatin. Holmes positioned Elias beside the conservatory window, where the lamplight cast his silhouette against the glass. The resemblance to the ghostly figure in the photograph was unmistakable, down to the characteristic tilt of his head and the angle of his shoulders. Your uncle was documenting his greatest discovery when you entered his study, Holmes concluded. The Codex Borealis had revealed not merely ancient burial customs, but a sophisticated method for preserving and revealing hidden knowledge through specialized flame chemistry. In his final moments, Sir Alistair was photographing both his triumph and his betrayal. The young man's remaining composure finally collapsed entirely. "I never intended for it to become so elaborate," he said, his voice breaking. I hoped that he would simply seem to have died peacefully in his study. But when I saw the photographic equipment, the documented evidence of his work, I realized that his death would be investigated thoroughly. The garden staging was meant to preserve his research while creating a mystery compelling enough to overshadow any suspicion of foul play. Lestrade, who had been listening with growing professional satisfaction, stepped forward with his handcuffs gleaming in the candlelight. "Elias Thorne, I arrest you for the willful murder of Sir Alistair Finch." The young man offered no resistance as the cold metal closed around his wrists. His brief moment of defiant justification had been extinguished as completely as a candle deprived of air. The elaborate deception that had transformed a simple act of greed into an impossible mystery had finally been laid bare, though the human tragedy at its heart remained as poignant as the flickering blue flame that had preserved the truth. As we prepared to leave the conservatory, Holmes extinguished the treated candle with deliberate ceremony. The otherworldly light that had illuminated both the crime and its solution faded into memory, leaving only the warm glow of ordinary lamps and the satisfaction of justice served. The candle that burned in the snow had fulfilled its purpose, revealing not ancient secrets, but the terrible modern truth of ambition corrupted and trust betrayed. The game was concluded, and the impossible had been rendered inevitable through the inexorable application of logic and observation. Yet as we walked back toward the warmth of the main house, I found myself reflecting on the tragic irony that Sir Alistair's greatest discovery, the preservation of knowledge through flame, had also preserved the evidence of his own murder. The warmth of Sir Alistair's study enveloped us as we returned from the conservatory, the familiar scent of leather-bound volumes and scholarly dust, providing a stark contrast to the cold revelation we had witnessed among the exotic plants. Holmes moved immediately to the mahogany desk, where the photographic equipment still lay arranged, his long fingers handling the delicate apparatus with the reverence of one who understood its crucial role in preserving both knowledge and justice. As Lestrade secured Elias Thorne in the custody of 2 constables, the young man's earlier defiance had completely drained away, leaving only hollow-eyed resignation. The weight of his confession seemed to have physically diminished him, his shoulders sagging under the burden of his terrible choices. Yet even in defeat, there remained something calculating in his manner that suggested the full scope of his deceptions had yet to be revealed. "The final irony of this case," Holmes observed, carefully examining the camera that had captured Sir Alistair's last moments, "is that the very method intended to preserve ancient wisdom also preserved the evidence of modern treachery. Your uncle's dedication to documentation proved to be his posthumous vindication." Professor Zimmermann approached the desk with scholarly fascination, his earlier distress now tempered by professional curiosity. "The photographic technique Sir Alistair was employing represents a revolutionary approach to manuscript analysis. The combination of treated flame illumination and chemical photography could reveal palimpsest texts that have remained hidden for centuries." Holmes produced several additional photographic plates from the locked cabinet, their silver surfaces catching the lamplight like mirrors reflecting forgotten secrets. "Indeed, Professor, these plates contain images of the complete Codex Borealis, including the hidden text that so excited the various collectors. But I suspect there is more to this conspiracy than simple scholarly rivalry." He moved to examine the fireplace where the partially burned correspondence still lay among the cold ashes. Using delicate instruments from his investigative kit, He extracted several legible fragments and arranged them upon the desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. The charred papers revealed portions of threatening letters written in multiple hands, their tone growing increasingly desperate and menacing. The correspondence spans several months, Holmes announced after careful study, and involves at least 3 separate parties: Cornelius Blackwood's consortium, Percival Vale's antiquarian network, and Baron von Stauffenberg's agents, all pressing Sir Alistair with escalating urgency. Elias shifted uncomfortably in his restraints, and something in his expression caught Holmes's sharp attention. "There is more you have not told us, Mr. Thorne. Your confession, while dramatic, has omitted certain crucial details." The young man's remaining composure finally cracked entirely. "You cannot possibly understand the pressure I was under," he said bitterly. "The collectors had been demanding proof of the manuscript's authenticity for months. I had been providing them with carefully crafted reproductions while promising access to the genuine articles once Uncle Alistair could be persuaded to cooperate." This revelation drew sharp intakes of breath from both Professor Zimmermann and myself. The scope of Elias's deception extended far beyond simple murder into international fraud, involving some of the world's most ruthless collectors of stolen antiquities. "The photographic plates your uncle was creating would have exposed your forgeries," Holmes observed with clinical precision. "Your crime was motivated not merely by greed, but by the desperate need to prevent the discovery of your previous deceptions." Holmes examined the Byzantine ring that Professor Zimmermann wore, comparing it to the chemical impression still visible on the conservatory door handle. The square bezel mark remains perfectly preserved in the chemical residue, a permanent record of the killer's presence. "Your uncle trusted you completely, Mr. Thorne, even as you betrayed that trust with poison prepared in his own laboratory. The collectors will not abandon their pursuit simply because I have been arrested," Elias said with desperate urgency. "They know the manuscripts exist, and they possess resources that make them far more dangerous than any individual criminal. Blackwood's consortium has agents throughout Europe, while Vale's network extends into the highest levels of the antiquarian trade." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with renewed interest. "Which is precisely why your uncle's photographic documentation was so crucial. The knowledge has been preserved and authenticated through official investigation, making it far more difficult for private collectors to claim or suppress." He moved to the window overlooking the garden where Sir Alistair's body had been discovered, his keen mind already working through the broader implications of the conspiracy. The elaborate staging served multiple purposes beyond creating mystery. It ensured that the death would attract official attention, legitimizing any subsequent authentication of Sir Alistair's research while deflecting suspicion from the simple reality of family betrayal. Professor Zimmermann carefully gathered the photographic plates, his scholarly instincts recognizing their immense value to legitimate research. These documents represent years of painstaking work. The cultural significance transcends any monetary value the collectors might place upon them. "Cultural significance doesn't eliminate the danger," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "Mr. Thorne's warning about the collector's persistence should not be dismissed lightly. However, the photographic preservation ensures that the knowledge cannot be suppressed or monopolized, regardless of what happens to the original manuscripts." As we prepared to conclude our investigation, I found myself reflecting on the complex web of human motivations that had transformed scholarly pursuit into deadly conspiracy. The case had revealed not merely a single murder, but an international network of collectors, forgers, and thieves who sought to profit from humanity's cultural heritage. "The candle that burned in the snow," I observed, "was intended to evoke ancient mysteries and scholarly obsessions rather than modern crimes and personal vendettas." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes replied. his expression growing contemplative. Young Thorne hoped that investigators would become so fascinated by the impossible physical evidence that they would overlook the simple human motivations underlying the crime. He understood that a mysterious death would attract more thorough investigation than a simple one, thereby ensuring his uncle's work would be preserved and authenticated, though he intended to claim credit for discoveries that were never his to possess. The irony was complete and terrible. Sir Alistair's dedication to preserving knowledge through innovative photographic techniques had not only documented his greatest scholarly triumph, but had also ensured that his discoveries would survive both his murder and the international conspiracy that had claimed his life. The impossible candle had indeed preserved truth, though not in the manner its creator had intended. As Lestrade prepared to escort his prisoner from the study, the full magnitude of the deception became clear. What had appeared to be an impossible mystery was revealed as an elaborate performance designed to serve multiple purposes, preserving research, concealing murder, and maintaining the illusion of scholarly integrity while engaging in international fraud. The game was concluded, but its implications would resonate far beyond the walls of the Finch estate, touching networks of collectors, scholars, and those who sought to exploit the boundary between legitimate research and criminal enterprise. The truth had been illuminated by the very flame intended to obscure it, a fitting testament to the power of methodical investigation over elaborate deception. The candle that burned in the snow had fulfilled its purpose, revealing not ancient secrets, but the modern truth that knowledge, like fire, could both preserve and destroy, depending upon the hands that wielded it. The departure of Elias Thorne in Lestrade's custody left the study enveloped in that peculiar silence which follows the collapse of elaborate deception. Holmes stood beside the mahogany desk, where Sir Alistair's photographic equipment still bore witness to the scholar's final triumph, his keen eyes already moving beyond the immediate crime to consider its broader ramifications. The household staff moved with quiet efficiency, their professional composure masking the profound shock of discovering treachery within their trusted circle. Professor Zimmermann carefully secured the precious photographic plates in protective wrapping, his scholarly instincts recognizing their immense value to legitimate research. These images represent not merely Sir Alistair's final discovery, but a revolutionary approach to manuscript analysis that could transform medieval studies. The tragedy is that their creator will never witness the impact of his work. Our contemplation was interrupted by Judson's appearance in the doorway, his dignified bearing strained by the evening's revelations. "Mr. Holmes, there is a gentleman at the door claiming urgent business regarding Sir Alistair's manuscripts. He identifies himself as Mr. Cornelius Blackwood and insists that previous arrangements must be honoured despite the circumstances." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with renewed interest. "Show him to the drawing-room, Judson, but remain within earshot, Inspector Lestrade. I believe we are about to encounter the true architect of this conspiracy." The man who awaited us possessed the unmistakable bearing of wealth acquired through questionable means. Tall and impeccably dressed with silver hair and cold eyes that missed nothing, Cornelius Blackwood radiated the confidence of one accustomed to obtaining whatever he desired through sufficient pressure and resources. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, his American accent carrying the authority of vast financial power, "I understand there has been unfortunate confusion regarding certain manuscripts my consortium has been negotiating to acquire. Young Thorne's arrest need not affect our established arrangements." Holmes settled into a chair with deceptive casualness, his penetrating gaze cataloguing every detail of Blackwood's appearance and manner. "I fear you labour under a misapprehension, Mr. Blackwood. Any negotiations conducted without Sir Alistair's knowledge would be considered fraudulent." Blackwood's expression hardened with barely concealed menace. My consortium has invested considerable resources in this acquisition. We possess documentation of agreements signed by the estate's heir, along with substantial advance payments creating binding legal obligations. Holmes produced the photographic plates from their protective wrapping, their silver surfaces catching the lamplight like mirrors reflecting preserved secrets. Sir Alistair's final work has ensured these treasures will be preserved for posterity in authenticated photographic documentation available to scholars worldwide. The impact upon Blackwood was immediate and profound. His carefully maintained composure cracked as he realized the exclusive access his consortium had sought to purchase was no longer obtainable. "You underestimate the resources at my disposal, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood said, his civilized veneer slipping to reveal the ruthless predator beneath. "This matter extends far beyond local constabularies. The consortium has invested too heavily to accept such losses." Holmes remained perfectly calm, his dangerous intelligence focused like a blade. "Your threats carry little weight against preserved knowledge, Mr. Blackwood. Sir Alistair's documentation has already been copied and distributed to multiple institutions. Destroying one set would merely ensure others receive greater protection." As Lestrade escorted the American collector from the premises under constabulary supervision, Holmes turned to address our assembled group with characteristic precision. "You perceive, Watson, how each apparent marvel masked something elegantly simple. The candle burned blue because stearine mixed with spirits directs heat upward. The glass disc prevented conduction to snow. The footprint-free path owed everything to Thomas's garden boards, the precise placement to a pruning pole. The body's peaceful transport employed a hand barrow. The serene expression resulted from swift, insidious poison administered through aniseed-scented pomatum." He moved to examine the chemical impression still visible on the conservatory door handle. The decisive evidence was the photographic plate capturing Sir Alistair's final moments. The camera preserved what pride omitted, that raised left shoulder, that characteristic posture, that insecure boldness of the young pretender. When I positioned Elias against the window, the silhouette confessed what his tongue laboured to conceal. Holmes's expression grew contemplative as he gazed once more toward the garden where the impossible candle had burned. The elaborate staging served multiple purposes beyond creating mystery. It ensured official investigation would authenticate Sir Alistair's research while deflecting suspicion from simple family betrayal. Young Thorne understood that mysterious death attracts more thorough examination than mundane murder, thereby preserving his uncle's work for future exploitation. Professor Zimmermann nodded with scholarly appreciation. "The photographic preservation defeats the entire conspiracy. Knowledge, once documented and distributed, cannot be monopolized or suppressed by private collectors." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The symbol served two masters. To Sir Alistair, the candle in snow signified guardianship and preservation. To his nephew, notoriety purchased through wonder. The same flame of knowledge will warm or scorch according to the hand that bears it." As we prepared to depart the estate, I found myself reflecting on the profound irony that Sir Alistair's greatest discovery, the preservation of knowledge through specialized flame, had also preserved the evidence of his own murder. The impossible candle had indeed fulfilled its purpose, revealing not ancient secrets but modern truths about ambition corrupted and trust betrayed. The game was concluded, but its implications would resonate through international antiquities networks for years to come, a fitting testament to the power of methodical investigation over elaborate deception. The candle that burned in the snow had illuminated truth in ways far more complex and enduring than its creator had ever intended. The cab that carried us back through London's snow-laden streets moved through a transformed cityscape, the pristine white blanket that had seemed so mysterious that morning, now bearing the ordinary tracks and stains of urban life, resumed. Holmes sat in contemplative silence throughout our journey, his keen profile etched against the frost-covered window as he processed the evening's revelations with that methodical precision I had learned to associate with his most intellectually satisfying cases. "The final irony of this affair, Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle completely resolved, "is that young Thorne's elaborate deception achieved precisely what Sir Alistair would have desired, ensuring his discoveries would reach the widest possible scholarly audience. Crime intended to suppress knowledge instead guaranteed its preservation and dissemination." I reflected upon the intricate web we had unravelled, from the international conspiracy of unscrupulous collectors to the intimate tragedy of family betrayal. The human element remains most disturbing, Holmes. That a nephew could murder his benefactor, for scholarly recognition speaks to corruption of the deepest sort. Indeed, though Thorne's crime reveals a curious paradox, Holmes observed, producing his pipe with characteristic deliberation. In seeking to claim his uncle's discoveries through murder, he ensured their authentication through the very investigation he hoped would establish his innocence. Sir Alistair's revolutionary techniques will now receive far greater attention than conventional publication could have achieved. Our contemplation was interrupted by a telegram awaiting us at Baker Street, its urgent message confirming that Blackwood's hasty departure had been intercepted at Dover. The American collector's threats had proven as empty as his claims of legitimate acquisition, his consortium's power broken by the simple expedient of making Sir Alistair's discoveries freely available to legitimate scholars worldwide. Knowledge freely shared defeats those who would hoard it for profit. Holmes observed with evident satisfaction, settling into his customary chair before our cheerful fire. Professor Zimmerman has agreed to oversee the photographic plate's publication through the British Museum, ensuring Sir Alistair's work receives proper scholarly recognition while remaining accessible to researchers globally. The warmth of our familiar lodgings provided a stark contrast to the cold deceptions we had unravelled. Holmes lit his pipe with ceremonial care, the aromatic smoke creating patterns in the firelight that seemed to mirror the intricate web of clues we had followed to their inevitable conclusion. "The case presents us with a meditation upon preservation itself, Watson," he continued thoughtfully. "The ancient symbol of the candle burning in snow spoke to guardianship. Knowledge protected against the elements that would destroy it. Sir Alistair understood this principle and applied it through photographic innovation, creating permanent records that no collector could monopolize or suppress. I poured brandy for both of us, the amber liquid catching the firelight like captured wisdom, while his nephew corrupted the same symbol for personal gain, transforming preservation into performance. Precisely. Yet even in corruption, the symbol fulfilled its original purpose. The impossible candle served as both beacon and betrayer, drawing official attention that preserved truth while concealing the simple human motivations behind the mystery. Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Each apparent marvel masked something elegantly ordinary: specialized candles that burned upward rather than outward, garden boards providing paths above snow, photographic chemistry preserving both discovery and betrayal in silver and gelatine. As the night deepened around our comfortable chambers, I found myself recording the final details of what would become known as the case of the candle that burned in the snow. The phrase would enter criminal folklore as a demonstration of how elaborate staging could both conceal and reveal truth, depending upon the quality of observation brought to bear upon the evidence. Holmes rose and moved to our window, gazing out at the snow-covered street with that mixture of satisfaction and philosophical contemplation that marked the conclusion of his most challenging investigations. Sir Alistair has achieved the scholarly immortality he sought, though through circumstances far more dramatic than any conventional research could have provided. His techniques for manuscript analysis will influence medieval studies for generations, while his nephew's deception has become merely a footnote to genuine discovery. The case had demonstrated once again that no deception, however ingeniously constructed, could withstand methodical analysis combined with keen observation. The impossible had been rendered inevitable through the application of logic to physical evidence, while human nature had been revealed in all its complex mixture of nobility and corruption. Another mystery resolved through reason applied to evidence, Holmes said quietly, his pipe creating gentle spirals in the firelight. Though this case will be remembered for demonstrating that knowledge, once properly preserved, cannot be destroyed by those who would profit from its suppression. The candle that burned in the snow had fulfilled its ancient purpose, preserving truth against the forces that would extinguish it. As I completed my notes by the dying fire, I reflected that this investigation would stand among Holmes's finest demonstrations of how methodical inquiry could illuminate even the most carefully constructed impossibilities. The game was indeed concluded, and knowledge had triumphed over those who would corrupt it for personal gain. The truth, like the specialized flame that had preserved it, burned with a steady light that no amount of deception could extinguish. Outside our window, London slept beneath its blanket of snow, while within our chambers, the warmth of solved mystery and preserved justice provided comfort against the winter's cold. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles and fresh challenges, but tonight belonged to the satisfaction of truth revealed and justice served. The impossible candle had burned its last, leaving only the eternal flame of knowledge to light the way forward.